Is it better next to me? Yeah.
Should we do a chant? Blockade, no! Blockade, no!
Blockade, no!
That looks all right.
Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon. Welcome, comrades, to Making Worlds Bookstore. By show of hands, has anyone been here before? Okay, great. So forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but Making Worlds is a worker cooperative. It's entirely volunteer run. We opened in, I guess, early 2020, and then we had to close for a couple months, and that ended up being more than a year. So we are volunteer run, which means we open as much as our volunteers allow us to operate. We host events Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays, depending on people's availability. We focused on a lot of issues, and I'm sure a lot of folks here are familiar with that involve internationalism, anti-capitalism, LGBTQIA community, racism, very Philadelphia focused, and also very international in terms of our perspective. So please feel free at any point tonight to look at the books on the shelves. You're going to be supporting us in paying our rent and utilities for the next month. A couple of housekeeping things. In the event of an emergency, there's one exit behind us on the screen. If you need to use the bathroom, please feel free to go around this way. If you have to go, you have to go, so don't feel like you're interrupting anyone, right? If you have any questions, I'll be back there with Gabrielle and Kayla, who are part of our Making Worlds co-op staff. And we hope to see you again at some point in the next couple of weeks, couple of months. I'm going to hand it over to Ira to take over for tonight. Again, welcome, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's event.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Peace. Free the land. My name is Hiram. I am an organizer by trade. Been here in Philadelphia for the past 12 years. I was a former director of the Philadelphia Student Union here in West Philly. Have been a member of numerous organizations and do a lot of work, most recently around the issue of political prisoners. I'm here. I went on the trip with my friends here tonight, and what we're going to be doing is just a brief report back, but also make sure there's enough time to involve you all in a dialogue and conversation. Since this isn't school, rather than just sit here talking to you, and definitely want to hear back from you. So really quick, from a show of hands, how many of you have been to Cuba before? Cool. All right, so there's a lot of stuff that's probably going to be repetitive, but definitely a lot of stuff that isn't, and definitely be plenty of opportunity for you all to share your own experiences going to Cuba as well, right? What we're going to do is we're going to open up with a brief video from the International People's Assembly, which is the brigade that we went on. We also have representatives here who went on the brigade with the National Network on Cuba. We're going to start off after that with our panelists, just some brief questions that they'll respond to. And then we'll open it up to you all, and for the remainder, and for the majority of the program, just a conversation amongst all of us, right, around all the issues that have been discussed here, or some of the ones that you all want to put on the table as well, coming from your own experiences on the island. Cool? Again, my name is Hiram. At any point in time, there's a question, you need something clarified, slow down, whatever, just let me know and we can take care of that. With that, let's just show the video real quick and then we jump right into it.
My name is Kabeta Ulo Kapahua. I'm a member of Academic Labor United, but I also organize the Hawaiian Independence Movement.
My name is Dee. I am the National Director of BYU 100.
Hi, my name is Ana Karen Alcocer, and I'm with Unión de Vecinos, the East Side Local of the LA Tenants Union.
Philip Agnew, Black Men Bill.
My name is Maria Oswan, and I'm with the Palestinian Youth Movement in the New York City chapter.
I'm Lillian House, and I'm with the Party for Socialism and Liberation.
Hawaiian Independence organizing at home looks like a lot of political education, direct action, protecting our sacred land, pursuing the demilitarization of the Hawaiian Islands, and dislodging U.S. empire from the Pacific.
So some of the work that we do in BYU 100 is mostly circled around criminalization of Black people. So the many, many different facets of our criminal justice system, including police budgets, including surveillance, including having access to resources, alternatives to policing. Many of those things are campaigns that our chapters and our organization is a part of.
We organize hundreds of tenants in the city of Los Angeles, low-income, immigrant communities, poor communities who are in a housing crisis in LA.
Black Men Bill is a national membership organization that is bringing Black men for gender, for justice in the country.
Palestinian Youth Movement is a transnational grassroots movement of Palestinian and Arab youth fighting for the liberation of our homelands from the forces of Zionism and imperialism.
For Socialism and Liberation exists to build a movement for socialism in the United States, and that means being involved in all of the struggles facing working class people everywhere in the country, uniting with and training the organizers that are emerging out of these struggles.
Over 150 youth leaders from progressive organizations across the United States traveled to Cuba from April 24th to May 3rd, 2023 as part of the International People's Assembly's May Day Brigade. They were in Cuba to learn about the impact of the U.S. blockade on the island nation and to gain insights into the experiences of building socialism in Cuba. During their visit, the young leaders from the U.S. met with Cuban social and civil society organizations, visited educational institutions, community projects, and cultural spaces to learn about the country's political, social, and economic system. They also saw how, despite all odds, the Cuban people continue to build, innovate, and advance, not only to better life for themselves, but for all of humanity.
Cuba has been a real transformational experience for many of us on the brigade, really seeing in real life what it looks like to build unity across people from all different backgrounds and coming from many different starting points. I think that we cannot imagine actually achieving a socialist transformation of society without being able to do this.
What I learned about international solidarity with Cuba is that our struggles are linked, that they also waged a struggle for housing, for dignified housing through the revolutionary process. They also waged a struggle for against a big private ownership of land by landowners who own multiple buildings and a lot of land. And that is what we're learning and taking away, that it is possible to fight for a world where everybody is sheltered, where housing is a human right and not a commodity, and where and also like to understand that the reason why people here in Cuba can't repair their homes is because they don't have the materials because of the blockade. The reason why we don't have repairs in our homeland is not because of lack of materials, because of the greed of people who benefit from the very miserable conditions under which we live.
Cuba offers political education lessons, but they offer real material change to the nations of the world who will continue to fight back against capitalism and imperialism and colonialism, racism, sexism, all the exports of U.S. empire. And Cuba's commitment to that really shows what internationalism needs to be for all of us, not just focusing on our own home struggles, but finding ways to support each other and finding our responsibility to each other to support each other's struggles no matter how we're connected, no matter where we come from. And Cuba exemplifies that in ways that are unimaginable.
What I've learned is that international solidarity requires a deep clarity about who is ours, who is on our side, and who is our enemy. And if you're unclear about that, it is a death sentence upon any version of solidarity. And so to witness what I have been able to see here in Cuba, African nations, South American nations, our delegation from the United States, to witness all of those folks here, not just show up, but talk about the exchanges that have happened. Not just standing up for people, but sending supplies, sending resources, sending people to ensure that your comrades a world away who may not look like you, who don't speak the same language, have the access to the fullness of human potential, to just survival, to thriving. That practice is so very inspirational. And really, no matter what we want to say about the shortcomings of the U.S. movement, international solidarity is not full, is not strong, unless it includes the United States. And so we've got a lot of work to do. We are not our government.
A few days ago, going into one of the transitional neighborhoods and them holding up signs, kids being out there just ready to welcome us to being a part of their revolution, learning about the real Cuba, and not holding on to some of the media and the propaganda that is so pervasive across the United States. Like, they carry so much love in their hearts for people, and it is not about being against Americans or being against the U.S. It is about being against imperialism, against colonialism, against racial capitalism, and that is the common enemy that we're all fighting for, and they understand it.
I think that in Cuba, you really see that international solidarity is not just something that we're, gifting upon Cuba from the United States, but it's a relationship that goes in both directions, and it's based on an understanding that we really do share one common enemy, and that we are side by side in this struggle, and that's really how we win. And I think that that's so important for people in the imperialist core to understand our responsibility, but also this true partnership, this true, relationship of equals with the working people of the world.
So coming to Cuba, the work to end the blockade, the work to support the Cuban political project, for me, have become a mental exercise. It was something that I knew had to happen, something that I understood through my study was an essential part of being a revolutionary in the United States. We had the opportunity to visit a biomedical facility here in Cuba, where we learned about the vaccines, the cancer vaccines that they have built and developed, the work around diabetes, and the work that they've done to develop a medicine for Alzheimer's. It was that conversation at a biomedical facility, a sterile place with white coats and purification and fermentation, and somewhere where you would not expect it, that the work to end the blockade touched my heart. My mother is suffering from early onset dementia. And so to understand that the United States government knows full well that the Cuban government, the Cuban people have designed a remedy for not just Cuban people, Cuban folks, but something that can help folks suffering from debilitating, deadly illnesses around the world, and still replies with, you know what, is anchoring, and it touched me in a way that I didn't anticipate. And so for me, that was the most impactful thing, to be in a place where you wouldn't expect your heart to be touched. And to see the work of the Cuban people, despite not having the resources, to still better the world through health and through innovation in science, that really touched me. And that's when the ending of the blockade went from my head to my heart.
Through our reflections with the Cuban people, through our reflections with each other, we've come to understand that all struggles against imperialism are necessary and important struggles, and the unity of these struggles is the only way that we can achieve liberation. And in the words of Hassan Kanakani, who is a Palestinian revolutionary writer, journalist, and a national hero, imperialism has laid its body over the world. Its head in Eastern Asia, its heart in the Middle East, its arteries stretching across Latin America and Africa. Wherever you strike it, you serve the world revolution. This is the most important lesson that we can remember from being in Cuba, and that Cuba has embodied and shown with its discipline and principle to us and to the rest of the world, standing in solidarity always, no matter what it costs them, with national liberation struggles around the world.
In 1959, the Cuban Revolution defeated 100 years war against colonialism and colonial occupation, right? 1960, the United States imposes the embargo and the blockade on it in an attempt to collapse not only the Cuban Revolution, right, the Cuban country as a whole, Cuban society as a whole, and that example, right, and that beam of hope that Cuba is for the rest of the world, but especially for the folks in the United States, like Philip said, who are suffering under the crippling consequences of capitalism. The way the United States has done that has been through an economic war, through the blockade. It has been through diplomatic isolation, right, attacking tourism, attacking diplomats from being able to discuss policies with other nations, and primarily through disinformation. Two brigades, predominantly of young people, right, went for May Day from the International People's Assembly and also the National Network on Cuba to fight back against that disinformation, to travel for themselves, for many of them for the first time, right, to see Cuba with their own eyes, to learn about it from the Cuban people themselves and not relying on CNN or Fox News or any other US corporate media to tell them what Cuba is, what Marxism is, what socialism is, right? But to see it, experience it for themselves, and come to their own conclusions, which was the whole point. And I believe many of you have gone on very similar trips as well. And so what we have today, and really briefly, is three young people, three young panelists who went on this trip, who are going to introduce themselves in a minute, going to answer just brief questions, and then we'll open it up. And definitely want to hear from all of you all and engage in a conversation together, right? And ultimately, we leave out of here, get a little clear about what solidarity for Cuba looks like, and specifically what this solidarity and the solidarity movement in Philadelphia, right, for Cuba look like moving forward, and find ways where our organizations, us as individuals, but also as organizations, can work together towards making that a reality. Cool? Cool. With that said, I'll let the folks introduce themselves, your name, the organization you represented, and really quickly also, why did you want to go to Cuba? One sentence, why did you want to go to Cuba?
Yeah, thank you all for being here. My name is Jasper Saw. I'm a Palestinian American artist, writer, and I'm an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I was on the International People's Assembly Brigade, and I think that the reason that I said yes to this opportunity when I was asked to go, is like what Phil said in the video, sort of turning this solidarity from something that's mental, something that I've studied, to something that is now like deeply felt in a material, in an emotional way. And I think that opportunity is something that we need to extend to more people, but it's also something that has reinvigorated my my own commitment and my own desire to, build a lasting, sustained organization in Philadelphia against the blockade.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Sorry, that's a quiet place. My name is Mecca. I'm from Philly. I'm also with the PSL, and there's a lot of reasons why I wanted to go to Cuba. I wanted to study the revolution. I wanted to talk to people about living under socialism. I wanted to know, what they were doing on the ground, what they were doing in the state. But the big motivation for this trip was I was at a point with, I guess my education of being a Marxist, where it was becoming a little bit difficult to imagine post-revolution, We're in such hard political times where all you think about is struggle. And it's imagine a world where we are building and are safe. I should just say, use the term safe, especially as a Black American, right? I wanted to go to a country and I wanted somebody to show me why we can't have nice things. Philip said that you go and they have nothing and they're making the best out of it and they're making these vaccines and they're supplying you with affordable, if not free housing. They have free healthcare. Children are not going without an education, right? We went to rural parts of the country where kids of all backgrounds had the opportunity to study. The thought of honestly being our generation, not getting a real job and becoming an artist, nobody's doing that anymore. You gotta get 4 or 5 jobs and then maybe you still gotta have 10 or 11 roommates, right? And there's 12-year-old kids who have huge, big dreams that are outside of being an influencer are a capitalist, they want to do things beneficial to society. And I was at a point right before the trip where I was a little pessimistic because I kind of felt like we had lost that as a class. And honestly, it gets a little scary sometimes because you're just these people got a lot of money and they got a lot of power and you're can we do it? And come back from Cuba, I really do think we can. And yeah, that's all I want. It's pessimistic, but no, I'm not.
Thank you. Peace, Free the Land. Can everyone hear me? All right. Peace. I'm Josh. I'm an organizer with Black Alliance for Peace in Philly and the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement's Philly chapter. The reason why I went on this trip, there are so many reasons. This was my second trip to Cuba. My first one was just a touristic trip where you can't legally go touristically because of the blockade, but it was a more sort of a vacation and an intentional solidarity trip. And even on that, you can tell the people are different, the vibes are different. And I knew that going in a more principled way would help me to uncover more of the truth, understand more of the base reasoning for the way why people are so kind and warm and loving here in a way that I haven't felt in any other place on earth, so what makes this place so special? And I feel I was really able to get to the root of it. But I'm also going to share this quote from Malcolm X that really inspired me and I feel motivated me for this trip, which is the only way we'll get freedom for ourselves is to identify ourselves with every oppressed people in the world. We are blood brothers to the people of Brazil, then Haiti, Cuba, yes, Cuba too. So he said Cuba twice in that. So that was part of a major part of the rationale was to be able to learn from people who have done this land-based revolution work, who are in 60 years of triumphant revolution but still struggling, So yeah, that's the intro.
Cool. Thank you. So the first question, before I get into the ones that are specific to you all, to know which ones of those was, touching on a lot of stuff that you all started to mention. The embargo has been, the blockade has been on Cuba since 1960. Donald Trump came in and added 240 more measures on top of what already existed. Joe Biden came and upheld all of those measures. On top of that, Cuba was also added to the list of sponsors of state terrorism that's completely devastated the country in ways that hasn't been seen since the so-called special period of the early 1990s, right? With that said, right, and Mecca, you started talking about a lot of these things, the amount of advancements that the revolution has been able to make inside of the country, right, continue. Not only continue to support and inspire the Cuban people, but inspire folks across the globe. And so really briefly, and this is a question for all of you, is just wanted to hear what were some of those advancements that stood out to you, right? That you learned about when you're over there, and based off your experience, your own eyes, what are the impacts, the current impacts of that blockade, that U.S. blockade on the Cuban people, and what does it happen on them today?
I guess I can get us started on that. Something that was really incredible to see for me was how every sector of society was organized in some way. There is, a format for like democratic participation in like shaping your day-to-day life. Whether you're a student, you can be part of the student federation or the student union. For I think like the density of membership in the women's federation is something like it's in the 90 percentile of women in Cuba are part of a mass organization that specifically is dedicated to advancing the struggle towards women's liberation. Speaking to students, speaking to workers, speaking to people who in pretty, like I said, every aspect of their life is, there's a way that it's organized, that it's collective, that there's, actual democratic participation in shaping reality, like really changed, I think, how I understand the idea of democracy, and what democracy really can look like, in terms of people, an everyday process of people like making their own reality, shaping reality. And I mean, maybe Mecca can talk more on this. I know we've talked about this together a bit, but also the idea of like what poverty alleviation looks like. And in the PSL here, we do a lot of work against unsafe development, gentrifying development, capitalist development. But something that I think we lose sight of in a lot of these struggles is that, these neighborhoods that are targeted for gentrification, for, exploitative development, where, landowners and contractors are shoddy buildings and, busting pipes and not fixing them, whatever, is that, these neighborhoods need development, need a lot of development. And to be in Cuba and see what that looks like in a holistic, way that serves people's needs, and is like specifically, I mean, Didi in the video mentioned communities in transition. Like, again, to our sort of American ears, sounds like a euphemism for like gentrification, honestly. But that when we visited these communities, like, of course, there's sort of basic material issues that are being addressed. Like there's subsidized grocery stores, access to electricity, like infrastructure, that sort of thing. But the core of it, like the first project in all of these neighborhoods was a community center that, gave access to like cultural events, a space to gather, like dance classes and music classes for young people. And it's like the exact inverse of the way that capitalist development, gentrification, et cetera, happens here, which purposefully destroys the social fabric of a community. And seeing this model of people-centric development where that fabric of social bonds, like that is what's being developed. That is what's being maintained and amplified through the infrastructure, through renovating housing, et cetera. So yeah, I mean, I can go on forever about this, but it's all of this again is happening despite the blockade, and I think it's inspiring to see what sort of social organization can do, like in the face of this sort of material deprivation that doesn't need to be there, obviously.
Yeah, that was not to be a promo, but that really blew me when we got there. We heard the statistic that somewhere like a little under because of Hurricane Irma. That's the one. Last really big hurricane, last two really big hurricanes. Home ownership is somewhere a little under 80%. Can you, if I can imagine, right? When is anyone in our generation going to be able to have that level, that percentage of home ownership, right? When have our parents, especially working class people, you know? And we would visit these neighborhoods in transformation. And I was just thinking, like, if we had the resources and like the state power, we could have like, you know, 1 million making worlds. We could have, you know, clean schools and safe streets and, you know, parks where kids aren't breaking a bone or stepping on a needle. You know, it's just, you create like a better world for like each other and for like future generations to come. And like capitalism in America is like only designed for profit, because things like this doesn't create profit. You know, create things that create people who go on to make more profit. It's like, you know, we're not investing in it. And that was one of the heartbreaking things, but it was one of the optimistic things. So like, even if the Buddha of imperialism like really stumps us out post-revolution, we still have all the makings to like make an amazing country, you know, like our community, we should say, because you know, we're without countries, you know, without flags and borders, but we could have like an amazing world to look forward to. And like, really, like, I don't know. Can you imagine if we like had a Cuba here, or we had like a Havana, any type of space where we had real working class solidarity, like across parties, political lines, like not everybody was politically active. Like if you weren't a Marxist or a Maoist, or you weren't political at all, or if you were like, oh, I'm leaving because of the conditions and I'm moving to the States, people still have the same level of militancy, right? We don't see that here, especially now on the left after, you know, whatever, we don't see that anymore. And I think if we dedicate their time and like create solidarity with people abroad and in our country who we don't necessarily touch all the time, or we don't always agree with, not saying we should work with the right at all. I just mean like us as a group, as the left, as a movement.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, that's a slippery slope these days. You gotta clarify it. Like just that overall solidarity. Like we are all pushing towards revolution. Right. We're like fighting for the same end goal, which is freedom. And I feel like it's getting muddled a little bit these days, because a lot of intercommunal arguing. But Cuba, existing under the conditions it has been for 60 years, is like keeping that line, you know. And I think that's something we can take back. That's probably my favorite advancement of the revolution, is that education part. They're sticking to it. I think that's the biggest influence of the revolution, is that people, you know, care about it.
And Josh, before you answer, if you want to share a little bit about your brigade, because your brigade is the national network on Cuba, and so if there's just some things that you want to highlight about that brigade, its makeup, who came along on that one, as you also talk about
for sure. Let me try and summarize. The National Network on Cuba is a coalition between a bunch of different organizations who are all sort of united politically against the blockade, against Cuba being on the state-sponsored for terrorism list. So for this brigade, we drew in members from, I want to say like 60 members from like 21 different states across the America. It was really beautiful to have like, I would say it was largely, I have another brigadista with me here, Ladies she's coming from the Bronx. Also, she just graduated med school. Let's go. But she was one of the people on the brigade. It was a lot of young people, but also there was great intergenerational exchange. We had some people who had founded the Venceremos Brigade, which is one of the oldest brigades, some people who had interviewed Fidel and Che and gone to Angola and been a part of like different armed struggles and revolutionary struggles. So there was lots of different organizations, people from different ranges, really covering from like 18 to 83. So it was a real diverse group, and that was an amazing. I want to start there. That was an amazing part of our brigade experience, and I like completely attribute that to the triumph of the Cuban Revolution and what you were saying about like social fabrics and human-centered development. Like people Cuba is like, Asada Shakur for herself called Cuba a place of healing, and Cuba for me was a place of healing, and for our brigade was a place of healing, because like socialism has such like a heart to it in a way that this society that we're in today has completely lost, or it, like especially with the United States, has never really had. So the like one of the most notable things for me, part of our delegation for May Day was going to like a series of lectures and conferences. One of those lectures was with I think a researcher in the biopharmaceutical lab, and speaking to sort of the commonalities between the Cuban people and the United States. And we saw some of that like in here, like the US completely prevents Cuban medicine, which would help people in this country. Like they don't let Cubans send it here. They're not even gonna approve it. They're never gonna approve it, let alone trying to help Cuba get any access to syringes, ventilators, oxygen, anything like that. So the United States has shut the door on collaboration there. But one of the things that we didn't actually even get a chance to talk to, he put up in comparison the top 10 leading causes of death between Cuba and the United States. And keep in mind, Cuba, as a result of the blockade, is like maybe one of the most impoverished countries like in the Americas. But you'll see like in the top 10, 5 and 6 for the United States, top 10 causes are suicide and drug overdose, not even on the list in Cuba. So like I think that was when it really hit me. Like we, in this country, we're suffering from individualism. It's not a system that works for people. This sort of opulent system around like consumeristic greed that we're living in, and that's like the way that decisions are made. It's people can't live like this, and people won't continue to living like this, and people are set. That's like, to me, a huge part of why like suicide and drug overdose are such huge factor, like huge reasons why people lose their life here, completely avoidable, completely not caused by lack of access to consumer goods, like caused in fact by like the country that's pushing out all these consumer goods, pushing out all this individualistic propaganda, pushing out like this capitalist form of relations. So I think to me, like the triumph of like socialism in Cuba, to me was like just socialism itself, you know, like it was seeing everyone share, like exactly like you said, Mecca, like everyone has this level of militancy, and this militancy towards like love and towards one another, you know, like one moment that stuck out to me, we worked on organic panicas. A lot of Cuba's food supply comes from like localized food sources, like urban gardens, stuff like that. And these urban gardens, they're already maintaining like razor thin profit margins, if at all, to sell their food, and they sell at a discount to schools and to hospitals. So like it's these business, like it's everyone in Cuba is like voluntarily not making a profit, not exploiting one another. You know, it's everyone working together to make sure everyone lives. And that's not the case here. You know, like there's no human safety net, there's no social safety net in the United States, and Cuba has that through an abundance of like love and people caring for one another. And that's why they survive to this day. That's why the revolution has triumphed. It's because and hold it together for one another. So that to me was the most, and you can see that everywhere.
Thank you. And so we'll jump into some other questions just for the panelists. We have about 20 minutes for this section to give time for the audience members to chime into the conversation. So like 5 minutes each. But sticking to what you were saying, what you brought up, and I think you were talking about Cuban society. You also talked about this issue of young people leaving, right? And what comes to mind is culture, but not only just culture, but the arts and culture, right? And Cuba has a very distinct society. Cuba is very Caribbean in many ways, very African in many ways, but it's also very Cuban in a lot of ways. A lot of that is manifested through its arts and culture. And so can you talk about a little bit of what you learned about the arts and culture in Cuba? How is it different from art, right, and culture in the US? And also, how is that being used to sell false dreams to the Cuban young people to force them, or try to convince them to leave Cuba and go abroad?
So, well, one of the most like prominent things I've noticed about the arts and culture, and it's definitely because I'm an American. I learned a bunch of individualism, but I went looking for myself. And I noticed that a lot of the art depicted and people in the media, they were Black. I was like, sick, rock and roll, love that, more of that. You know, we get that here, but we really have to force to get that here. But that's beside the point. One of the things I think that's pushing young people out, besides the conditions of the blockade, is one of the things I learned from, I can't remember his name, but he owned like a communist bookstore. He like rented out his house. And he was telling us how there's a radio station, radio tower, right on like Miami Beach, right? And you can get American radio in Cuba. And it's just like anti-Cuban like propaganda, nonstop, right? Like Cubans living in Cuba, Cubans living in Miami, YouTube channels, like these podcasts, fucking us up too. Who knew? It's happening there too. Podcasts, stuff like a lot of distrust within the government, which is kind of manifesting as distrust of all governments, and it's a shame. On the note of like why young people are leaving Cuba, I had the privilege to like have lunch with Raul. He was our bus driver, so he like drove us everywhere throughout Cuba. It was great. He would eat lunch and dinner with us every day, like breakfast. And we had a few conversations. And his son left a year ago, and he moved to Miami with his two sons. And he makes $1,200 a year, $1,200 a year as a mechanic, because he's an illegal immigrant. He makes $1,200 a year, right? To us, that's fucked up. But the money that he gets to send back home to like build a future for his kids to move back, it's a lot, right? The US dollar was a lot. And that's driving a lot of people to like leave the country to get education, like to further their educations here to get jobs, right? And it's sad because they don't necessarily want to leave their community. They don't want to leave Cuba, right? Like they're very proud Cubans. But just the blockade conditions is like forcing them out. And this is like a young man with an immense amount of talent, right? He went to school for engineering. He has an engineering degree that's not worth anything here because it's Cuban. And he can do amazing things for us as a people, you know, huge strides if he had the opportunity. But, you know, it doesn't exist, you know, outside of Cuba. Like, regular people don't get these opportunities. I was talking to his dad, and he was just like, you know, it really hurts for me to have to let him go. But he has to learn on his own, right? He has to learn what the conditions of, you know, the states are. He has to, like, live with the reality. You know, most of his graduating class left the country and went to the States. So he has to learn like they do, like they did, or, you know, maybe will in the near future. You know, that's not always greener, in that US propaganda is very powerful, has a lot of money behind it, has a lot of like international support behind it. You know, it's not just the US, it's like British media, it's Canadian media. When we had internet signal strong enough, like electricity in the hotel we were staying at, like you got to watch the TV. I watched like a telenovela in Russian, and you get like news reports from like Chile and Venezuela, but you get shit like BBC too, right? And it's just like fucking Tories like talking about how bad socialism is. And one of the things people who I was talking to in the streets would say, oh, the blockade doesn't exist, right? That's crazy. It does. Like, we know that as Americans, our politicians brag about what they do to Cubans, right? Like, they just brag about it. They've been bragging about it for 60 years. It's Trump's biggest achievement, right? The different shit that he's throwing on Cuba. And it's common. I like talk to like young organizers, like, oh yeah, that's like one of the common things that's coming up and why people are leaving, is that like, no, the blockade doesn't exist, the government's just stealing money. And I was like, yeah, that sounds like, you know, people here who I talk with, like even Black people who are just like, oh, slavery didn't happen. Shit like that, that's like Holocaust denial. And I'm just like, how does that like, I don't know, what am I trying to say? In a place like Cuba that has won a revolution 60 years ago, like fresh off, like battlefield is still warm, right? How does that level of like fascist propaganda seep in to a country with so much political education and like militancy, right? What's happening generationally and like culturally that's allowing this to like, enter in. And I think it's just out of sheer desperation, you suffer for so long and you don't know anything. Like younger generation don't know the good years of, Cuba financially. Like they're born all in the fall of the USR, so they don't know financial stability at all. And they're just like looking for an answer. And sadly, the answer outside of what's offered by the Cuban government is what's offered by fascists 90 miles off the shore. So that's one of the big things people who like work in media are like trying to combat. But I think it's going to be hard, especially like with how popular social media is and how important we rely on, like how much we rely on media for things. But I've noticed that.
And those are other consequences of blockade, right? The blockade isn't just economic blockade; it's also communication blockade, right? And so the United States gets to decide whether Cuba gets internet or not, which is wild, right? And imperialism now in 2023, which we were told by some of the folks over there, not told but explained, looks very different from the way it was explained and outlined when Lenin wrote his book way back in the early 1900s, right? Where it was about monopoly capital, militarism, and all that. But the emphasis now on cultural hegemony, right? And exporting US culture and using the arts and culture. So where under capitalism, art, right, like you're explaining, is very individualistic. It's about me, it's about me selling it, it's about me getting my shine. Where over there, right, it is about the community. It belongs to everyone, right? Art belongs to everyone. It's not to be sold, right, but to be shared as a part of that culture. And unfortunately, given the deep consequences because of the blockade and the terrorist list, right? You have so many young people who have no real options, right, at providing for themselves anymore, are being forced to like leave in record numbers as a result. One thing that comes up as we talk about that, we're talking about the influx of US propaganda, the social media, which is really having a devastating impact on Cuban young people specifically, is this question around race and anti-blackness, right? And much was made of that protest that happened in June 2020, I believe it was, right? 2021, thank you. 2021, right? That got a lot of folks riled up on Twitter, got a lot of Black-led organizations in this country rethinking that historical unity, right? That Cuba has, not with Black people, not only here in the United States, but on the continent as well. And it's caused a lot of misinformation, a lot of distortion. It's done really a lot of damage to the historical unity between, right, those two groups of people. And so, Josh, if you mind, just speaking a little bit to that, right, the history of racism, anti-Blackness in Cuba, but what does that look like today? How has the revolution been combating that? And how's the United States using that to drive a wedge between, right, the solidarity movements here in the United States and the Cuban people?
Yeah, I think just to start to speak to, or to pick up from what Mecca was saying, like part of the reason young people in Cuba, like, and there's a disconnect towards the revolutionary values of Cuba right now is precisely because of the targeted media campaign from the US focused entirely on overthrowing, undermining, destroying Cuban sovereignty. So it's completely part and parcel of the blockade. The US spends at least $50 million a year to just like push people in Cuba to produce anti-revolutionary media. And like Mecca was saying, the US dollar goes a really far way in Cuba. So there are people whose entire careers, like who have built entire careers, purchased multiple properties in Cuba, this kind of thing, just to be like content creators for counter-revolutionary stuff. So the US is like incentivizing the counter-revolution by creating the conditions for the blockade in the first place, funding the opposition. And I think what we're seeing now, like the sort of media firestorm around like anti-Blackness in Cuba, and if Cuba is like secretly like a racist country and that like disrespects Black people, and that Fidel and Che were like opportunistically using like the decolonial struggle. These are some of the things that people have like shared with me about their thoughts on the Cuban Revolution, and I think it goes back to a problem of, like miseducation in the first place, and the US is in complete communications control with Cuba. Cuba has like not only been a consistent ally of like Black people's sovereignty here, African decolonization. I want to speak to that first before going into like anti-blackness in Cuba. But to say at the top, like the U.S. is the biggest funder of like white supremacy in Cuba because it funds the Cuban far right to commit acts of violence against Black Cubans consistently. So anything that this nation says about racism in Cuba is entirely hypocritical because this is the country that profits from it. This is the country that creates the conditions for it. And Cuba has like, after Hurricane Katrina, Cuba had 1,500 doctors at the airport in Havana, bags packed, who were gonna fly in. And they were hit by Katrina like 2 weeks before. So they recovered instantly because that's what Cuba does. They sent their doctors to the hospital. They sent their doctors to the hospitals to pack up and then to the airport, and George Bush wouldn't let them in. And there's like there's these many instances of this throughout history that like we're not made aware of, that people don't talk about in the first place, where Cuba has attempted to be in literal solidarity with the oppressed people here, and as a result of the blockade, because the US doesn't want that, of course, like why would they want oppressed people to be in solidarity? Like that's been prevented. So I think people in the first place don't know that Cuba has a very, very active through the present history of international solidarity with African people here, African people in the Caribbean and Latin America and the continent. So I think that's the first part of it, is the miseducation and the misinformation. And to speak to sort of the reality of the situation in Cuba, Cuba's like a very, very African country, you know, and I realized that was what really opened my eyes on this trip. Like my first time I went to Cuba, I was like, oh, there's a like if you go to Miami and see Miami Cubans, that's not the image that you're presented with about like what Cuba's right, what Cuba's like. But actually going to Cuba, you see that everyone, like in the first place, everyone sort of regardless of like is like Cuba's an African country. Like Africa is the heart of like Cuban culture, and that's where like the culture of this country comes from. So there's a sort of intentional acknowledgement towards its roots that's protected in law. It's actually written into the Constitution. Like the preamble of the Constitution starts by saying like this country is built from like the blood of the Africans who were brought here and the indigenous people who were like conquered by the Spaniards. So like there's like very culturally, it's a place that is very, very deeply in touch and honors its African roots. You know, Santeria is the largest practiced religion. The second largest practiced religion is a Congolese religion, Mukumbi. So African religions are prominent, public, used in government affairs, celebrated. Like African music, African culture, African food, it's everywhere. So there's one part of it you can't like, so getting to the point of anti-blackness, you know, when Africanness is so prominent, you know, the way people identify sort of, it's not like the US. It's not like you're being labeled as like Black, and Black immediately becomes a disqualifier for any kind of engagement in society. So Afro-Cubans, like when people talk about Afro-Cuban issues or identify as Afro-Cuban, you know, there could be one person, there could be two people who could be as Black as each other, who could sit right next to each other, one identify with Afro-Cubanness, the other not. And that's because like Afro-Cubanness speaks to sort of those specific cultural practices in part, and it's speaking to like specific practices around like music, dance, history, like religious practices, and that's not something that everyone in Cuba shares in. So there are people who are engaging with their own identity differently. And in general, I'll say, yeah, I want to land the plane. I don't want to ramble too long on this, but I'll say to like make the comparison between the racial segregation and disparity in the United States versus Cuba. Like all Cubans were colonized people. You know, Cuba was a colony. So the fundamental race relations are different there than in the United States. It's not like it's not necessarily like the situation you have here where there's an ethnic group of settlers, of white supremacists who like consistently throughout history like consolidate their power on the genocide of another group. Cubans of different races, ethnic backgrounds, were all colonized peoples who all fought together in our land-based struggle to like free themselves from an imperialist like colonial ruler. So I think in that way, like Black people have a lot in common with Cubans of any race in the Cuban revolutionary process, like as a decolonial process. Like we have a lot to learn from that. And I'll say on anti-Blackness in Cuba itself, as part of the National Network on Cuba, for our brigade, we got to meet with one of the founders of Red Barrio Afro Descente. Her name was Maritza. I have some notes on it. I'm gonna go off my head, and the ladies, if I'm wrong, just check me. But this is the largest Afro-Cuban organization in Cuba. It's a voluntary organization founded mostly by women educators, artists, queer African women who came together to like address sort of these, I guess you would say, like attitudes, like a systematic structure of race-based exploitation, which Cuba doesn't have. There's no systematic exploitation of Black Cubans by the government, by capitalist industries, by anything like that. So what remains are these attitudes that were caused by 400 years of colonial occupation and now 60 years of right-wing propaganda sent from the United States. So what Africans in Cuba are uniting and building to do is creating what they call like a revolution within a revolution, which is like this idea that we're still a part of the revolution, you know, like we don't see these issues as like taking us out of the revolution, making us not Cuban. We see these as like our growth edge as a country. This is like how we advance the revolution, is by opening ourselves to like changing our minds, changing our processes, changing our sort of attitudes in the country towards each other on issues of race. You know, candidly, like people talked about their experiences with discrimination, their experiences like with colorism in the country, with anti-Blackness. But to make the point that I made earlier, you know, as a result of the way Cuba is, it's not necessarily like there's not like a white Cuban power structure in Havana that's holding people down. It will be like Black Cubans will discriminate against other Black Cubans. Like certain hotels will have discriminatory policies, and organizations like Red Barrio Afro Descente, like community organizations, get together with revolutionary leadership, with Communist Party leadership, with trade unions, to do popular education as a means of like undoing and working through these things. So I just like Cuba's in a very, very sophisticated phase of its revolutionary journey, 60 years in. So the Cuban people have developed like really, really amazing and communal, like transformational sessions and transformational educational ways of like working through issues as communities. And I think like on anti-Blackness in Cuba, I really think that's what's happening there. Like there's discrimination that happens, but it's discrimination that no one's trying to hide, trying to cover up, and everyone's trying to collectively resolve and answer to, which I think puts it opposite here.
And you raise a great point, right? We're talking about 500 years of occupation, right? And expecting 60 years of revolution to undo 500 years of colonialism is just not fair and it's inaccurate, right? But post-revolution as opposed to revolution, where like stark segregation and explicit racism is night and day, right? One thing that stands out to me is that commitment to not only African roots, but African people on behalf of the revolutionary government and the Cuban people themselves has looked like missions to go free Angola from their colonial occupation, right? Sending troops from the government purposely left them to die, right, in that water, right? It was the Cuban government and the Cuban people who were trying to make it 90 miles, right, a little more to New Orleans, away to go save what they consider family, what they consider to be blood, right? Blood of my blood and flesh of my flesh. And the whole, given everything we learned and we talk about with the blockade and these historical commitments that Cuba does not break for anything, regardless of what is happening to them, right? Is this issue and the topic of medicine and doctors, right? And so, Jasper, if you can speak briefly about, briefly about what have been those medical advances in the face of all of this oppression, terrorism from the United States, and what does that look like for the globe? Because there's also a whole medical school program, right, specifically for international students. So if you can speak to some of those.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not a doctor. We have a comrade doctor in the audience, so maybe she'll be able to speak a little bit more about what it's like from the perspective of someone who's gone through med school in the United States. But we had the great opportunity on our brigade to visit the Latin American School of Medicine, which was founded in the late 90s after a particularly bad hurricane season. And whether it's, the attempt to New Orleans, there was also a lot of, they were in the news around COVID, going to Italy at the beginning of the pandemic, in the news when Bolsonaro expelled the Cuban doctors from Brazil. And even though they are everywhere, like they can't be everywhere all the time, because there's Cuban patients to treat as well. So that was the thinking that went into founding the Latin American School of Medicine. And initially, it was just for Latin America. They sent brigades to Central America, to South America, the Caribbean nations, in the aftermath of hurricane season, and realized that providing a training ground for indigenous doctors from these countries was the way that would really, build up the capacity to make a long-term effect. Just parachuting in and doing disaster relief is essential, but it's not, solving the issue of medical access. So, I mean, it's expanded in the last 30 years to an incredible degree. We got to speak with students from literally all over the world. And like I mentioned before, all sectors of society are organized. We were speaking with the steering committee of the Student Federation at the Latin American School of Medicine, which consisted of people from Uganda, from Chile, from Colombia. There was a guy from LA. Like, Americans can go to the school, which you would never learn about. I mean, that was a surprise to me even when we got there. It wasn't until we got there that I realized, like, oh, there's people from the US that are studying here for free. And the sort of agreement is that these doctors, after they do 3 years of pre-med, learn Spanish, and then specialize with an additional 4 years at a hospital in Cuba. But the agreement is that they go back to their communities, that they practice, the Cuban style of really holistic, preventative medicine. And in a lot of ways, this sort of approach to medicine, in one way, it's pragmatic, because the blockade prevents a lot of materials, pharmaceutical materials, like Josh was saying, syringes, bottled oxygen, from making it into the country. So, preserving those materials as much as possible, doing as much preventative, and sort of holistic care as possible, just makes economic sense. But these students were also talking about how it makes social sense. How as doctors at, this international school, they're being trained to take care of people, as people. As entire persons that exist in a social fabric, and not as like sort of isolated symptoms, treating things in like a symptomatic or overly medicalized way. And something that really touched me is the number of Palestinian students at the Latin American School of Medicine. We got to speak to several more, I mean, like over a dozen, and there have been dozens and dozens of graduates. I forget the exact number off the top of my head, but something like a quarter or a third of doctors practicing in Gaza right now were trained at the Latin American School of Medicine. And again, just sort of a demonstration of what international solidarity actually looks like in a material way, and not sort of, I mean, of course, there's an ideological element, but a lot of the students that we talked to, I was speaking to the student from Uganda, and he was like, I wasn't a communist before I came here. He was like, I wanted to be a doctor and help my community, and wanted to do it for free. And after 2 years of being in Cuba, experiencing this, like then, for him at least came the ideology. And I think that, is really demonstrative for, I think, a way forward in a small scale on, the level that we can. Demonstrative as a way forward for us here, the way that we can reach people. And I think, that's something that we want to open up to the room about. What does it look like to, one, share this information as broadly as possible, like, change how people think about Cuba, but also build a fighting movement against the blockade here in Philadelphia, and bring people around, who might not be, might not understand the sort of world historical significance of the Cuban Revolution, or ideologically be totally on board with socialism, or not totally understand what we mean when we talk about like people-centric development or the socialist reconstruction in society, but building a movement that will allow us the space to bring people around to those ideas, and in the meantime also do everything we can to end this blockade, allow Cuba the space to breathe, allow Cuba the space to live, because I think all of these advances that we've talked about is just like a fraction of a percent of what the Cuban people and the Cuban Revolution are capable of. And yeah, I mean, as a country, this process in Cuba is an example for the hemisphere, the world, and we have a lot of work to do, and we're positioned. We have I forget what exactly, people were talking about this all the time. Forget exactly what Chase said. Something like we're lucky to have this fight here in the belly of the beast. I don't know if we're lucky, but we got to do it. It is our task, and yeah, I mean.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. And thank you for the question you posed to the rest of the folks. I think we heard on the trip, and like many of y'all have experienced in your trip, right? The way socialism is discussed in Cuba isn't a lot of rhetoric, isn't a lot of jargon, isn't a lot of quotes. It's speaking in terms of social justice. It's speaking in terms of putting people first. It's speaking in terms of unity and solidarity, right? Of sacrifice and struggle for the betterment of all people, right? And we've seen that unity, we've seen that struggle, we've seen those sacrifices made by the Cuban people. And I think that it's important for us as we speak and put the question out to you all now, right, about solidarity and protecting the Cuban Revolution, is to think of why. Going outside of just, because I feel bad, or because it feels like, or whatever, right? Like, how does protecting the Cuban Revolution, how does the Cuban Revolution help advance the work that we do in this country? Because for Cuba, it's not about exporting their revolution, and they'll tell you that all the time, right? It worked for us here. This doesn't necessarily mean that the way we did it is good. You have to figure out what that looks like for you. What we will commit to is standing by you and supporting you, right? And so as we think of building solidarity for the Cuban Revolution, and a big reason is because there's also an age gap that is happening. That revolutionary generation of Fidel, of Raul, and Che, all those folks have either passed on or are passing on. And there are generations of Cuban people, right, who will never know who they were in person, don't know what Cuba was before the revolution, don't know what that revolutionary period was, right? And creates a lot of rifts. It can create a huge gap ideologically if the Cubans are not on top of it and fighting back against, right, the cultural hegemony and cultural imperialism that's coming from the United States. But also the Cuban solidarity movement in this country is also aging out as well, right? And when you go to a lot of these rallies, you go to a lot of these meetings for Cuban solidarity, there's folks who are much, much seasoned than a lot of us are.
You're very kind, Howard.
us youth, you know what I'm saying? Us youth gotta so it means that the younger people in this country as well also have to step up and meet that task. And so the question to you all, as you share your own experiences in Cuba, is what does Solidarity for Cuba mean in terms of your work here, right? How does the Cuban Revolution and Solidarity for Cuba advance and support the work that you are doing in this country? And if you want to share some experiences that help highlight that for you on your own trips in Cuba, by all means, share those as well. And so we'll open the floor. If you have questions for the panelists as well, you can ask them questions. Yeah.
I just wanted to thank you all for doing this. My name is Reagan. I'm with the YCL, and I had the privilege of spending all of last summer living and working in Havana. It was an experience that I struggle to think about or talk about without crying because it is so different. You know, I used to go to things like this and think, oh, they must be romanticizing it. They must be, you know, fetishizing the revolution. They must be doing it. And then I went there and I was like, I don't want to come back. And then you're kind of forced to come back. And you see all of the problems around you and how easily they could be fixed if there was a will for it. And, you know, I've been back for 9 months and I have yet to have the emotional strength to do a panel like this. And the fact that you all just came back and you're able to do that, I have a lot of admiration for all of you for being able to get up and share this experience. And I would love to hear a little bit more on that kind of post-hoc side, what the transition back has been like for you, how you've been dealing with returning from a place like that to a place like this. And, you know, if you have any advice for those of us who are still struggling, that would be great.
Let's take a couple questions and then answer them. Any other question? Anybody else want to? Santos.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Asanto from Mature. Statement and a question. I think when it comes to quote unquote anti-blackness, whether that's said in Cuba or here in the United States of America, I look at who says it when it comes to people of African descent. 2 years ago when we had all the things going on about Cuba, we had some prominent Afro-Cubans being very vocal about quote unquote anti-blackness and racism. But if you dig a little further, go to their Twitter, their Facebook, whatever, you find out it's not so much the anti-blackness, and there is racism in Cuba, no one denies that. But look at those people who I call Afro-Cuban gusanos, because they are decidedly anti-socialism. Bar none, they are anti-socialism. They don't want to be socialists. And that's something we have to struggle with as well, because over in the United States, people still say, well, socialism is a white man's thing, and Marxism is a white racist, and yada, yada, yada. Most of them have bad marks. Most of them don't know the difference between Carl and Groucho. So we got to deal with that. And lastly, for anyone on the panelists, if you could talk about what you observed or learned about the new family code in Cuba, and in particular what that means for the rights of children, for marriage, for queer folks, for young people, etc. So thank you all.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question for the panelists. Because there's like there's a whole culture war with all the U.S. propaganda. I want to know like how the socialists in Cuba, how they're trying to get people from over here to learn more. I want to learn how like it's organized and like how one can actually go to Cuba, like someone that's never been. Like I want to know how like that was all organized and how that information gets spread and how they're trying to fight the information battle. And that's what I want to know.
Great question. So we can stop right now with those three, and then if we have time to open up some more. So we have the question around transitioning back to the U.S. after you've gone to Cuba and experienced all that. How do you do that, right? There's one about the family code, and then one around combating the information wars that are happening, but also these solidarity trips, right? And these opportunities are created for folks from this country to go over there and visit, right? How is that done? And so if each of you pick one of those questions to respond to, then we'll have some more time for everybody else. So
I can go with the first one.
Okay, I'll do the last one then.
all right, bet. In 2 minutes.
Oh, it'll be quick. I cried a lot. It's like the moment we touched down in Miami. First of all, Miami of all places. One of the first things I noticed was that the Havana airport, the only food that you could buy there, because of like everything was like shut down, just because they can't get the supplies. There's no gasoline. They can't get to one part of the island to get like produce and meat. So they were just like selling cheese sandwiches. And not just cheese sandwiches, not grilled cheese sandwiches. They were busting this good cheese. But then we get to Miami, and it's just so much abundance, right? And everybody who I know has been in Cuba, it's like prepare yourself for like when you get to the U.S. and you like look at the shelves and you look at the ads, and you're gonna feel it. And I felt that shit. I'm sorry, I cuss a lot. But I walked in, and it's like Tiffany ads, and it's Kylie Jenner vending machines, and there's 100 plus. It's like the second largest airport in the country, right? So it has everything. And there's armed like TSA agents and like cops, and they're like grilling you and shaking everything out of your bag. If your cameras were held for several hours, like secondary questioning, they had their belongings taken, their phones raided. They made one woman like dump her suitcase, and they made her carry the contents throughout the airport and took her bag. You know, just like little petty psychological games that we were immediately felt with, right?
And how many cops did you see over there?
Just none. I saw like security guards around the president, and they weren't warned. They're like linen shirts. Like I, what are you gonna do, big fella? You know. And I got back to the United States, and I was like, I remember sitting in the airport, and I got a bunch of vegan food because it's hard when you're a vegetarian in Cuba. Everything's pork. And I was just sitting there, and I was just like, I have to work 40 hours in 3 days. The moment I had to touch it in Philadelphia. And I got home, and I like sat on my couch and I just cried for like a long time. And I remember thinking, I'm getting emotional. I was like, they're like robbing us of everything, like dignity and like food and housing, and like Cubans, they want to give, you know, they want to share, and it's like we're preventing that, you know, we're strangling the people because they like want to love, you know. It's just, it's that really big cultural shock. Like I came back and I was like, well, now I'm gonna build a solidarity movement so we can like beat this, and we can break the blockade within the next like 3 to 4 years, let alone 5, you know. So I came back and I was like, I have a mission, you know, like I've got to win class power, I've got to win black power, I've got to win gender power. And it's like, I was so defeated when I landed in Cuba, but like I came back and I was like, all right, well, everybody stay the fuck out of my way, because I've got a lot of shit to get off my chest, you know, like learn to do perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the family code is a fascinating piece of legislation, and I'll try to be brief. And I think the most important thing to talk about with regard to that is actually the process, more so than the you know, the letter of the law itself, which itself is very, you know, extremely progressive, probably definitely the most progressive in the Americas, maybe the most progressive in the world. You know, for the first time legalized gay marriage and a whole bunch of, you know, legal recognition for alternative family structures, you know, rights for parents, grandparents, children. Trans people, all sorts of things that we're still fighting for here, or we won and are now being rolled back by reactionary movements. But the, you know, and the sort of basic idea is that it gives every Cuban the right to a family, whatever that looks like, more or less. But the process of doing it, passing it is fascinating. We got to meet with some representatives from the National Center on Sexual Education, which spearheaded this process. And, you know, they said at the outset that like they could have proposed a bill in the National Assembly. The National Assembly could have passed it, and that could have been it. They could have done this from the top down, and that would have been legal, and that would have been fine. But they decided to go for an intensively democratic and consultative process, specifically because of the history of machismo and the currently existing patriarchal structures in Cuban society at a social level. So the National Center for Sexual Education, the Women's Federation, popular organizations like the one Josh mentioned. We got to meet with people from the Martin Luther King Center that does a lot of work on this sort of similar stuff. Formed a committee that drafted this legislation, and then the National Assembly approved it. The National Assembly, half the seats are elected from the municipal level, from the neighborhood level up, directly elected by Cubans. The other half of the seats are elected through the mass organizations that I talked about. So trade unions, the Women's Federation, the Student Union, the Young Communist League, these organizations. So it's a democratic body. It's the main legislative body. Passes this draft of the Family Code. And then they do 79,000 community meetings, bringing out 7 to 8 million people, which is 2/3 of the population of the country, to talk through the draft line by line, to have these struggle out these contradictions within their communities, like people to people. If someone's homophobic, transphobic, whatever, instead of just like the National Assembly passing a law that this person can be against, they have to go to a community meeting and look face to face with community members, with their friends, with their families, and explain themselves, struggle it out. And so 79,000 community meetings, millions of people, discussing every line, every letter of this law. The committee, God bless them, have to go through the minutes of all of these meetings. And they end up revising, based on these community consultations, like 48, 50, 50, just about half, of the initial draft gets revised. Then the National Assembly approves that again, but it's still not over because it goes to a popular referendum countrywide. One more minute, gotcha. Well, we're pretty much there. So then, so even after all of that, every person in the country had the opportunity to vote yes or no on the final package. And it passed with about 68% of the population approving it. So, again, just an example of what democracy can look like. And also, what a process for actually, not just on paper, not just in a legalistic way, but actually struggling through these deep contradictions in society through a revolutionary process, could look like. Because, just because you have a revolution doesn't mean these things go away overnight.
Right. Door to door, attempting to transform society by redefining what family is, right? Give protections, like I said, to everyone, regardless of the way they identify. Everyone has a right to a family. Everyone has a right to adoption. Everyone has a right of protections from their family, especially those who carry marginalized identities, right? As we transform society moving into the 21st century, like Jeff said, door to door. Really quickly, because we're pretty much at time, we have to start wrapping this up.
Yeah.
But how can folks, right, learn about brigades? How does Cuba combat against the misinformation campaigns?
Yeah, so I think the brigade, those two things are really linked, sort of like you were alluding to. I think how Cuba, the US's strategy is one of intimidation, bullying, and actual violence and terror. US sponsored terrorism has killed thousands of people. Cubans don't respond with any kind of vengeance or tit for tat violence back to the United States. Solidarity is how they respond to the war of misinformation against against their revolution. So, Cubans are very proud of what they built. So they want to invite people from all over the world every year, multiple times a year, to partake in these like brigades and see the triumph of the revolution there, because they have nothing to hide. Like the truth for them is powerful enough, and the truth is like the greatest weapon that they have on their side. So these solidarity brigades, I can't recommend them enough as like a truth-telling mission for the Cuban Revolution and for ourselves as revolutionaries, like for the triumph that we know socialism like is in our hearts, or the triumph that we know like revolutions are in our hearts. Like Cuba embodies that. And to say on our specific brigades, like there are a number of brigades that happen in Cuba throughout the year. Like solidarity plays an important part for how they survive. I think Cuba's entire syringe, like all the syringes that they use are donated in solidarity trips. So that's just like one example of the kinds of like material goods that the blockade like denies Cuba access to, that solidarity helps to provide, and shared work that we know, like the labor that we put in when we were part of these brigades. These are like a real important part of how like Cuba's revolution continues to like stand. And the brigades themselves, there are 3 that happen from the U.S. throughout the year, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe 4. You can probably speak more to the format.
We can give you a list.
Yeah.
We're done of all the different ones.
Yeah, definitely. But I would definitely say that like the solidarity campaigns, like Cuba doesn't have any ill will towards the people of this country, because they know that like sort of like what's happening in their country, we've been miseducated about their struggle. We don't know the truth about Cuba. So they like offering us this platform, just a means to like visit them, help them build their revolution, help them build even the tiny amount that we do. It's just the truth of the matter is like Cuba doesn't need to lie. It doesn't need to, like, some people do call themselves like propagandists pretty openly, but like the mission of propaganda in Cuba is a mission of truth telling and like countering the disinformation by getting particularly like activists from the United States, because the United States is waging the war, but activists from all over the world to go to Cuba to partake in like the mission that they're undertaking. So
cool, thank you. We're at time, right? We're at time, as we want to respect the folks at Making World Books, but really quick, want to give an announcement. June 25th, the National Network on Cuba is holding, and a bunch of other organizations are holding a major rally in Washington, D.C., and are calling on as many people to come down to demand to Joe Biden to end the blockade on Cuba, and most importantly, remove Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terror, which is having, again, devastating impacts on the people in Cuba in terms of the energy crisis, food shortages, and all that. So all of you who can make it down to DC on the 25th, please do so. You will also run into a bunch of other folks from all the different brigades and all the different ways you can get to Cuba. We'll definitely be there on the 25th, June 25th. Again, thank you for all of you for coming out. Thank you to our panelists. Congratulations to the sister on graduating medical school. And with that said, if you want more information, June 25th, I'm sure you can follow, right? Black Lives for Peace, Party for Social Liberation, the Young Communist League, all those pages on Instagram always have a bunch of information to stay in too. And definitely come back and visit the bookstore, because the bookstore is the shit and it's really dope. So when you're out in West Philly, well, here's a reason to come out to West Philly, right? Definitely hang out here, because this place is a treasure. With that said, thank you for coming out.
Yeah. Also, real quick, I think part of what this is meant to do is inspire like sustained momentum and organizing in Philly, specifically around Cuban solidarity. So if you are interested in that, if your organization's interested in that, please let's just share information with us before you head out the door.
With any of us.
Yeah.
Yes. Especially you then. So all you young people, us young people, I mean.
Yeah, Santo.
Well, I'm going to make an announcement for a quick announcement.
One announcement, and then we got it.
Okay. So, take a flyer. We are organizing against the 76ers trying to build an arena in Chinatown.
Boo, 76ers.
But, can I just ask all you sports fans, if you haven't won a championship in over 40 years, why do you need another arena? Anyway, another thing. One more announcement. Justice for Angel Davis campaign. A young woman who was shot in the head twice by a landlord terrorist officer. You should not count risk death to be evicted, and the eviction might have been illegal. So check that out too. All right, thank you so much.